Before death, Pat Morita finally confirms what happened on the Karate Kid set. He spent years making people laugh on television. Then one audition tape changed everything, and the producer, who tried hardest to keep him off the film, ended up calling him personally to apologize. Before Pat Morita passed away, he talked openly, more than once, about the fight it took just to be seen for the role that made him a legend. And today we're putting those pieces together, because the real story behind Mr. Miyagi is stranger and more human than the movie itself. Most people who grew up watching The Karate Kid think of Pat Morita as if he was born to play Mr. Miyagi. The calm voice, the patient eyes, the handyman who turned out to be a master. It feels inevitable now, like there was never any other possibility. But that is not how it happened at all. When casting began in the early 1980s, Morita's name kept surfacing, and it kept getting crossed out. The man in charge of the production, producer Jerry Weintraub, had seen Morita perform stand-up comedy years earlier and knew him mainly as a fast-talking nightclub act. To Weintraub, that background disqualified him completely. He wanted someone who felt like a real dramatic actor, someone who could carry grief and restraint in total silence. A comedian, in his mind, simply could not do that. So for weeks, Morita wasn't even brought in to read. It's worth sitting with that for a second, because the role of Mr. Miyagi is now inseparable from Pat Morita in the cultural memory. But at the time, one of the most powerful men on the production had already decided, without ever watching him try, that Morita was the wrong choice. Casting directors kept searching elsewhere, bringing in actors who looked more like what Weintraub imagined. Older, weathered, classically trained. None of them clicked. And through it all, Morita's name kept getting mentioned by other people on the production, only to be dismissed again. The person who refused to let it go was director John Avildsen, the man who had already directed Rocky and knew what it took to make an underdog story feel real. Avildsen believed that the heart of this film wasn't the karate. It was the relationship between the boy and his teacher. If that bond didn't feel true, nothing else in the movie would matter. So he insisted that every plausible actor get a fair look, whether the producer approved or not. When Morita's turn finally came, he wasn't a priority pick. He was one of the last names on a long list, brought in almost as a formality. At that point in his career, Morita wasn't in a strong position to be picky about auditions. His momentum from shows like Happy Days had slowed. Work had become inconsistent, and he had spent stretches of time in Hawaii, taking whatever paying jobs came his way, hosting events, writing bits for commercials, performing in small clubs. It wasn't the trajectory he had once imagined for himself. And somewhere in that quieter, less polished period, he let his hair and beard grow out. Not for role. He simply stopped trying to look camera-ready, because for a while, there was no camera waiting for him. That decision ended up mattering more than he could have predicted. When he finally sat down for his first meeting with Avildsen, the clean-cut sitcom performer that audiences knew from television wasn't the person who walked in. What Avildsen saw instead was someone who looked lived in, someone who carried a bit of weight and history on his face. Morita later described that first meeting as unusual because Avildsen didn't bring in a room full of executives to judge him. It was just the two of them, and Avildsen held the camera himself for most of it, asking him to talk simply, honestly about his own life before ever getting to the script. According to what Morita told The Hollywood Reporter years afterward, Weintraub had made his position clear long before that meeting ever happened. He recalled Weintraub insisting he didn't want a comedian anywhere near the part, that he considered it a heavyweight role meant for a real dramatic actor. That line stuck with Morita because it captured exactly the wall he was up against. He wasn't just auditioning for a part. He was trying to convince someone who had already made up his mind. Avildsen's screen test told a different story than Weintraub expected. Morita didn't perform the material like a joke or lean on the comic timing people knew him for. He slowed down. He let silences sit. He spoke with restraint instead of punchlines. Avildsen was convinced almost immediately, and he told Weintraub directly that the search was over, that this was their Miyagi. Weintraub's response, by most accounts, was blunt disbelief. Pat Morita, the comedian, playing this role? He wasn't interested in even watching the tape at first. Avildsen kept pushing anyway, and eventually got Weintraub in a room where the footage played during a production meeting, unannounced. The reaction in the room shifted the moment people actually saw it. Weintraub, by his own later admission, was moved by what he saw on that tape, even though he still wasn't fully convinced the comedian in front of him could sustain the role over an entire production. That is where the real test began, because impressing a director in a private room is one thing, and convincing a skeptical producer and a nervous studio is another. Morita ended up having to prove himself 5 separate times before the role was finally his. The first 2 rounds asked a simple question: could he repeat what Avildsen had captured? Or was that first tape a fluke? Morita delivered the same quiet intensity each time, refusing to slip back into the comic rhythms everyone expected from him. The third test raised the stakes further, because this time Ralph Macchio, the young actor already cast as Daniel, flew in so the studio could see whether the two of them had any real chemistry. A mentor and student relationship carries an entire film like this one, and if it didn't feel believable between these two specific people, no amount of good acting from either of them individually would save it. What the studio saw instead was something that felt unforced. Macchio has spoken since about how naturally he found himself leaning on Marita in those scenes, the way a nervous student might actually lean on a patient teacher. The fourth test added costume to the equation, putting Marita in the simple GI that would become instantly recognizable to audiences. With the beard, the slower cadence, and now the wardrobe, something clicked into place that hadn't been fully visible before. People on set who had doubted him started describing the change as if he had physically transformed into someone else. The fifth and final test was the harshest version of all. No sets, no props, an empty soundstage, just Morita and Macchio performing together while cameras rolled for the studio heads to judge in real time. There was nothing left to hide behind. According to Morita's own account, that stripped-down performance is what finally settled the argument. After that fifth test, Weintraub called Morita directly. Morita later recounted that Weintraub told him he had nearly made the worst mistake of his career by keeping him out of the running and congratulated him on landing the role. It's a striking moment when you consider how firmly Weintraub had resisted even a single reading only weeks earlier. The man who had said in no uncertain terms that he didn't want a comedian anywhere near this character was now the one picking up the phone to admit he had been wrong. For Marita, that call meant something beyond simply booking a job. It was validation after years of being boxed into a certain kind of role because of his background in comedy. Winning the part was only half the challenge, though, because once filming began, Marita still had to figure out how Miyagi should actually sound. This mattered enormously to him. Hollywood had a long, uncomfortable history of using broken English for cheap laughs, especially with Asian characters, and Morita was determined not to let Miyagi become another version of that. If the accent leaned too far into caricature, it would undercut everything the character was supposed to represent. If it sounded too smooth and polished, it wouldn't fit a man written as an immigrant who had lived through war and loss and learned English later in life. Marita has said that part of Miyagi's clipped, deliberate speech pattern actually came out of pure exhaustion during the audition process itself. He was simply worn down from testing over and over, and his energy came out slower and more careful. Rather than fight that instinct, he refined it into something intentional. Short phrases, deliberate pauses, a rhythm that made audiences lean in and actually listen instead of waiting for a punchline. That choice paid off in ways nobody could have fully predicted. Lines that could have sounded corny on paper, like his advice about a man who catches flies with chopsticks being capable of anything, landed instead like genuine wisdom because of how carefully Morita delivered them. Macchio has talked about how disarming it was to work opposite that voice, since he personally knew Morita as quick-witted and fast-talking off-camera, and the contrast between the real Pat Morita and the quiet, measured Miyagi was almost jarring the first time he experienced it up close. Morita also spoke, over the years, about specific moments on set that stayed with him long after filming wrapped. The scene where Miyagi gets drunk and reveals the grief he's carried over losing his wife and child was one the studio worried about including at all, unsure if audiences would accept seeing the character that vulnerable. Morita pushed for it anyway, and by most accounts from people who were there, the set went completely silent after he finished the take. It wasn't the kind of silence that comes from an awkward performance. It was the kind that comes from watching someone hit something true and raw. For an actor who had spent years being seen mainly as a comic figure, That moment mattered to him personally because it proved he could carry real dramatic weight on screen. There was also the smaller, lighter side of the shoot that Morita remembered fondly. The scene where Miyagi tries to catch a fly with chopsticks, which could have played as simple slapstick but instead became a moment that revealed Miyagi's playful, competitive side. And there was his relationship with Macchio, who was still a teenager during filming and dealing with the pressures of sudden fame. Marita, decades older, naturally slipped into something like a mentor role off camera too, not just on it. Macchio has since described their bond as one of the things that gave the film its emotional core, on screen and off. By the time the production wrapped, the skepticism that had once surrounded Morita on set had faded into something closer to respect. People who had privately wondered whether a sitcom actor could pull this off watched him earn the crew's confidence scene by scene, until nobody was questioning it anymore. Morita would later reflect that the role gave him something he hadn't expected. Not just a career revival, but a chance to be remembered as an artist rather than only as a comedian who happened to get lucky once. Looking back at the whole arc of the story, what stands out is how close it came to never happening at all. If Avildsen hadn't insisted on giving every actor a fair shot, Marita might never have been in that room. If he hadn't spent that stretch of time in Hawaii and let his appearance change without planning to use it for anything, the screen test might have landed differently. If Weintraub hadn't finally sat still long enough to watch the tape Avildsen kept pushing in front of him, the entire chemistry between Miyagi and Daniel that generations of fans grew up loving might have belonged to somebody else entirely. Morita himself seemed to understand, later in life, just how many small, uncertain moments had to line up for that role to end up in his hands. And once it did, he made sure nobody who watched it would ever be able to imagine anyone else playing the part. That's the story Pat Morita told, in his own words, across interviews over the years. The fight to even be considered, the 5 rounds of testing, and the phone call that finally proved him right. If this changed how you think about the Karate Kid, let us know your favorite Miyagi moment in the comments, and stick around for the next behind-the-scenes story we got coming up.